So what I'm focusing on is it's a continuation of my master's thesis that I did at the Tartu University in the semiotics program. And I'm a first year PhD student in the department. And my paper and my current research is about a semiotic model for smart home affordances and trajecting semiotic components in a technological living environment. And to begin, I'll go over a brief definition on what smart homes are. And this includes, in the black fonts, you'll see a lot of other definitions on what other researchers outside of semiotics define what smart homes are. So some key takeaway points, this includes linking separate devices within a household to a network, using technological devices within an environment to be able to be controlled automatically. And one of the things that's needed is a home network, an intelligent controller, and a gateway in order to generate home automation. And in the blue is my definition, and that is a home with a technological network and system that is capable of perceiving environmental stimuli, which can influence automatic or controlled functionality. So in order to truly grasp the notion of a smart home, you also have to look at what is a smart appliance. So a smart appliance utilizes sensors and actuators, and these devices are able to react to external signals. So when the television first came out, we had to turn the knobs in order to change the channel. But now, since the invention of the remote, we can use the sensors of the remote and the actuators within the television in order to change a channel. And from the marketing stance, the notion of smarts essentially refers to doing new ways of old technology. So by incorporating this new sort of interaction with this device, it has this connotation that like this is a smart device. And my research focuses on smart homes that are on a grid, meaning that it has a power grid. So it's not so much self-sustaining homes, it's more so just connected into a broader ecological scale. And you have the devices that interact with one another, but they still rely on a controller to feed all of the information to. And for me, what I'm really looking at is the interactions and these interrelations between the user, the smart home system, and the creator. So these three agents essentially interact with one another to be able to enhance the meaning-making process. And this is where semiotic engineering comes into hands. And semiotic engineering roughly had its start in the early 2000s, and it focuses more so on human-computer interaction. And its core intention is to enhance the meaning making that a user generates within an artifact. So this can include the interface of the object, how the device communicates to the user, and so on. But one terminology that I think very much fits to the notion of semiotic engineering is by Winfried Noth. He talks about a sign's trajectory. And you can see in the parentheses, he talks about a sign is emitted by a sender that is aimed at the receiver's mind. And the sender's intention describes a trajectory from its starting point to its target. And what this is relating to is the interpretation by the user isn't always what's expected. They may achieve the desired outcome or the expected outcome, but it's more of a curved path rather than just a straight shot. Additionally, semiotic engineering focuses on meta-communication because the user interacts with the designer through the artifacts. And this method of communication is unidirectional since the user has to rely on the context within the interface of the artifacts in order to communicate with the designer. So in regards to smart home system, if I want to adjust the automated functions of like my lights that turn on at 6 o'clock at night, I have to know how to interact with one device in order to act with the smart home system. And what I did is I used for the notion of four semiotic components, and I applied them to a semiotic engineering theoretical foundation, because I believe that these four notions are very useful, whether it's for researchers outside of semiotics, even semioticians, or even designers as well. So the four semiotic components consist of resources, competences, affordances, and scaffolding. Resources are elements used to discover and learn new meanings with an object, and competences are how we discover meaning within the environment, but how we recombine them within a pragmatic model. Affordances are the descriptive action possibilities between the organism and the environment, and the scaffolding generated by semiosis and describes how the organism seeks to learn. So I'll in a few other slides, I'll break down these when it comes to the user, the creator, and the smart home system. And additionally, the notion of semiotic substances. This includes the learning, memory, and knowing. These also play a key factor in the meaning-making interrelativity between the three agencies. Additionally, you have to understand from the creator's perspective, who's using your object and who are you making it for. And this is in line with Persian terminology. So rather than using the term target user, which, it's very, more so in sort of consumerism, what I'm looking at is the potential user relates to the rhomatic sign, meaning it's a sign of possibility. So if you're designing smart homes for senior citizens, this senior citizen is the rhomatic sign. You want them to actually know how to use this technology. The actual user is the decent sign, since there's an actual existence. So, if there's a younger kid in the home that is techno savvy, it's much easier for them to appropriate this technology rather than the senior citizen who was initially purchased for. So this is by having a better understanding on how your product is being used and in what way and by whom it's being used, it allows to enhance the meaning making. Additionally, for me, I enjoy affordances to look at semiotically for two main reasons. The first off is goes along what Echo said about how you have to look at the denotative and connotative functions of an object, because as a user, as a creator, you have to assume and sort of predict how a future user in a future state will interact and behave with an object. So you can make these sort of assumptions, but you have to be very methodical about it. Additionally, when it comes to this interaction and these affordances, once a user knows how to interact with an object, such as knowing how to turn a door or how to hold a water bottle, this process becomes subconscious, because we already have the grounds of learning, memory, and knowing in order to perceive how to interact with this object. So once this cognition is scaffolded, we just sort of don't perceive affordances per se. So to me, it's quite fascinating, because we don't really see the characteristics of the object. And that's something that through this research, it's definitely made me look at how I perceive objects differently now. So now looking at the individual semiotic components, I'll pick out some key points ones, and you can read through them as well, since there's a lot of them. So semiotic resource for a user, this primarily relates to the different texts that a user can rely on to learn how to interact with this object, whether that's product tutorials, maybe it's a how-to video online, or even peers. For the creator, by integrating prior knowledge, such as by still integrating the knobs on the television, but still giving them the ability to interact with the remote, this still is a form of semiotic resources, because they can still rely on discovering new meaning in a different sort of interaction. Additionally, the current market trends is a big one for creators. There's been a growing amount of products released due to COVID-19 a lot of these devices are made to combat the spread of the virus within the home, whether it's doorbells that can read your temperature or air purifiers that kill 99% of the virus. And the affordance structure matrix, which is used more so in architecture and in product engineering, but this is also a good resource for designers to understand the positive and negative affordances, whether it's artifact to user affordances or artifact to artifact affordances. And essentially, this is made to be able to eliminate the negative affordances. For the system, resources consist of the quantity of users and how frequent a device is being used. Competence for the user, it varies depending on if you're a rheumatic user versus a decent user. For instance, a rheumatic user focuses on what would I use this for in my home? And additionally, you have to have a broad understanding on what sort of lower level affordances are needed, such as, do you need a monthly payment subscription for this product? Do you need a high bandwidth in order to actually have it operable in your home? For the decent user, you have to look at more so, how do I install, how do I program, how do I scaffold these bigger meanings and these home automations? So the competence, it greatly varies depending on the degree of intelligence within the home itself. So for the creator, essentially by knowing who you're making it for and by how the user is using it, increases the competence and serves as a useful resource as well on what's the purpose of making this object. For the system, one interesting thing is being able to differentiate different types of users, such as the administrative users, the limited access and service users. And you can see in the parentheses the different types of users, because a parrot can interact with an Amazon Alexa, and the smart voice assistant, it can't it can't differentiate between a human adult user versus a parrot because of this aspect of mimetic speech. But for a kid's language and a kid's speech, this device can differentiate because of the pitch frequency. So in my opinion, this is a very interesting phenomenon that hasn't really been combated yet when it comes to these corporations and these smart voice assistants. Affordances for a smart home, when in regards to shaping behavior, the affordances for a user leads to more meaningful and dynamic interactions due to the aggregated technology. So it allows for more meaning making to exist and more sort of automated scenarios to exist. As you can see in the system affordances, they kind of go hand in hand. So by these devices being networked together, you can essentially scaffold the right sort of behavior you want within your home. For the creator, one of the key takeaway points is to ask, what does the object want? Such as, this object wants to bounce, this ball wants to bounce, this ball wants to not break, this cup wants to not burn my hands. So this want is definitely associated with the affording characteristics. Semiotic scaffolding relates to, for the user, owning a smart home as a trajected goal. So building off this notion of having a smart home, but knowing how to actually utilize this sort of living environment. And for the smart home system, one of the key takeaways is homeostasis. So by being able to design a state of constant, and that's essentially what the smart home system should go towards. That's because it relies on the user to have a sense of trust that the smart home system will do what it's expected to do. And as some final notes, for the future of smart home technology, a universal protocol language for the future devices will be very useful, because right now there's a big issue with heterogeneous languages within the devices itself. So that means a lot of these programming features are incompatible because it's lost in translation. And in regards to do-it-yourself revolution, an an aspect of consumers being able to design their own products and to be able to adjust the programming. It will subsequently improve their semiotic components. So I believe this will be a big step in being able to give the users the competence and being able to scaffold the right technology they want within their home. And the integration of neural networks within the smart home system will enhance the system's semiotic substances as well. So we're slowly getting there, but it's not quite there yet. And additionally, rather than looking at smart homes as one vague entity, I foresee it being broken down into smaller niche habitats, such as smart communities, in-home healthcare systems, and eco-smart homes. So what I'm focusing on now is more so senior citizens using smart home technologies. So that's kind of the niche that I'm focusing on for my research. And here are my references for the presentation.
Many thanks, and can you please present your other peers?
Sure.
Many thanks.
So up next is Maria Clara Lucifora from Argentina. Her presentation title is Competing Speeches, Possible Myths about Artificial Intelligence. She has been a professor since 2008 and has a Doctor of Letters since 2016 from the National University of Mar del Plata in Argentina. Since 2008, she's a researcher at the Group of Semiotics of Discourse within the Institution of Humanities and Social Sciences at the National University of Mar del Plata. Additionally, since 2014, she's been a professor of the Semiotics Chair and the teacher in digital journalism. Also, she is the Dean for the Faculty of Humanities of UFASTA since 2020. And lastly, her focus is on semiotics of knowledge, social and cultural practices, and of ideology of power.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias por la presentación. Mi investigación comenzó hace unos años y con la intención de encontrar perspectivas semióticas para generar pensamiento crítico en torno a la tecnología. En este caso voy a centrarme en uno de los mitos. Pensaba hablar de más, pero por cuestiones de tiempo voy a hablar solo de uno de los mitos posibles en torno a la inteligencia artificial. Voy a compartir mi pantalla. ¿Ahí se ve? ¿Sí?
Sí, perfectamente.
Muchas gracias. La motivación fue me vi reflejada en esta cita de Barthes, que afirma en Mitologías, ¿no?, que el punto de partida de la reflexión de esos artículos que él escribió en ese momento era un sentimiento de impaciencia ante lo natural con que la prensa, el arte, el sentido común encubren permanentemente una realidad que no por ser la que vivimos deja de ser absolutamente histórica. En una palabra, sufría al ver confundidas constantemente naturaleza e historia en el relato de una actualidad, y quería poner de manifiesto el abuso ideológico que se encuentra oculto en la exposición decorativa de lo evidente por sí mismo. Me resultó sugerente esta cita porque es lo que me sucede a veces un poco con los discursos sobre la tecnología, ¿no? Cuando hablamos del mundo digital, pero especialmente de la inteligencia artificial, nos enfrentamos a una cantidad de discursos globales que crecen exponencialmente, tanto a favor como en contra. La dupla Apocalípticos e Integrados, que postulara ECO en 1965 para estudiar el fenómeno de la cultura de masas, puede actualizarse hoy con nuevos matices y nuevas etiquetas, tecnopesimistas y tecnooptimistas. De ambos grupos fluyen supuestas verdades que tratan de naturalizarse socialmente y dominar el discurso y, en definitiva, el pensamiento sobre un tema. Es tarea del mitólogo, tal como afirma Barthes, desmontar estos discursos y reconocer el mito, es decir, el sistema semiológico que se superpone para distorsionar el sentido inicial de un fenómeno. En esta oportunidad analizaremos la inteligencia artificial como objeto mítico. Al ser un objeto tan nuevo, poco conocido, y que transforma tan rápido y radicalmente nuestra vida, genera gran cantidad de discursos que, más allá de hablar de ella, hablan de las posiciones ideológicas desde las cuales se aborda. Pero antes queremos retomar brevemente la noción de mito de Roland Barthes, la que expone en su libro Mitologías de 1957, en el cual realiza una crítica ideológica a la mítica cultura de masas difundida por la sociedad pequeño burgués de Francia. Para el semiólogo francés, como dice ahí, el mito constituye un sistema de comunicación, un mensaje. No se define por el objeto de su mensaje, sino por la forma en que se lo profiere. Cualquier objeto visual, verbal, conductual, puede constituirse, ¿no?, en palabra mítica, dotada de una significación en un contexto social preciso. Por tanto, un objeto se transforma en mito si hay un uso social que se agrega a la materia, pues la historia humana hace pasar lo real al estado de habla dotándolo de sentido cultural. Estoy explayándome un poco sobre la definición que consigné ahí de Barthes, ¿no? Así es como la mitología solo puede tener fundamento histórico, pues el mito es un habla elegida por la historia, no surge de la naturaleza de las cosas, sino que es una naturalización de lo histórico. Como dice Gabriela Simón, afirma que para Barthes esta naturalización es una lógica u operación que produce como efecto de sentido el reino de lo natural, ¿no?, entre comillas. La naturalización consiste, por tanto, en una operación discursiva que encuentra su lugar en la enunciación de la doxa. La doxa es la opinión corriente, el sentido repetido, como si nada. La naturalización como operación discursiva se materializa en el mito, el cual se inscribe en distintas materialidades o soportes. El mito no oculta, sino que deforma el fenómeno y transforma la historia en naturaleza. Lee la significación como si fuera un sistema de hechos y no un sistema semiológico. Esto también lo dice Simón. Por eso el mitólogo o el semiólogo debemos realizar la operación de desnaturalización para distinguir los sentidos construidos en torno al objeto y realizar lo que se llama un desmontaje semiológico. Aquí podemos ver un poco el esquema que plantea Barthes en ese libro, ¿no?, del mito como segundo sistema semiológico que se superpone al sistema semiológico primario, que sería el que él retoma de Saussure, en este caso, significante, significado, signo lingüístico, y ese signo lingüístico es el que en el mito es la materia, ¿no?, es la forma, perdón, el significante, que se une a un nuevo significado, concepto, ¿no?, y forma en definitiva un segundo signo, el signo que él llama mito, que es la correlación entre esta forma y concepto que parece natural, pero que en realidad no lo es porque surge del discurso dominante, ¿no?, de determinada ideología. Y lo que hace no es ocultar el objeto, sino deformarlo y desviarlo de ese sentido inicial. En los discursos que circulan actualmente hay una serie de afirmaciones que son o están en vías de ser mitos en torno a la tecnología y pugnan por transformarse en una verdad de sentido común según la cual nos manejamos. En esta oportunidad nos centraremos principalmente en uno, que es que la inteligencia artificial puede tomar mejores decisiones que los seres humanos. Acá tomé una cita de una página que se llama Factor Capital Humano, pero que me pareció muy significativa, sobre todo en las cuestiones que están en negrita, ¿no? Las máquinas pueden llegar a tener la misma capacidad que los humanos, la inteligencia artificial ayuda a eliminar los sesgos de nuestro cerebro, puede recoger y contemplar toda la información, ¿no? Es mucho más rápida que nosotros, no entiende de emociones, por lo que la fluctuación no tendría, en el sesgo no tendría cabida, puede hacer las asociaciones correctas, se dice acá, y las bases para tomar decisiones serían superiores a las que puede tener un ser humano. Serían racionales, ¿no? Bueno, ¿qué significa racional en este caso? Como señalan Almirón y Jarque, los discursos tecno-optimistas emanan de un entramado de discursos provenientes del mundo académico, del mundo corporativo, especialmente de las grandes empresas tecnológicas, del mundo gubernamental y de los medios de comunicación que se inician en el siglo XX, y se desarrolla estrechamente ligado a los postulados del capitalismo y en especial del neoliberalismo. En el caso del mito que nos ocupa, la inteligencia artificial es más eficiente en la toma de decisiones que los seres humanos, se destaca como un valor máximo la eficacia, lo cual implica menos errores, más objetividad y variedad de datos en tiempo real. Se define a la IA a la inteligencia artificial como una imitación de la inteligencia humana, por lo cual se las puede considerar similares y al mismo tiempo en contraposición, otorgando superioridad a la inteligencia artificial. También se modifica en este mito el sentido de la expresión toma de decisiones, pues se refiere a ella como una facultad que consiste solo en el procesamiento de datos factibles de ser traducidos al lenguaje binario para que sean leídos por las máquinas, entonces no es la totalidad de la información, como dice esta cita, y en la que la presencia de, por ejemplo, emociones supone una falla o un problema. En cuanto a la significación del mito, se pretende instalar entonces que la eficacia y la rapidez son valores más importantes en la toma de decisiones que una visión holística y una reflexión detenida que considere todos los aspectos del problema. Esto es así porque a partir del Big Data y del 3B, que lo caracterizan, volumen, variedad y velocidad, se considera que los sistemas de inteligencia artificial tienen la información necesaria para evaluar la realidad y tomar decisiones de un modo más fiable que nosotros, al no intervenir la subjetividad humana. Como dice Eric Sadin, filósofo francés, se trataría desde esta perspectiva, se tendería, a la gestión sin errores de la sociedad, que es un poco lo que plantea también esta cita. Así, el tiempo de reflexión que necesita el ser humano para analizar es reemplazado por la velocidad y el nivel de procesamiento en tiempo real de la inteligencia artificial. Según este mito, se evitarían los sesgos cognitivos y emocionales en favor de una mayor objetividad, más allá de posibles sesgos que, por ejemplo, según Google, cuando habla de inteligencia artificial, estos sesgos solo se producen por una mala gestión de los datos. Es decir, no habría para Google sesgos humanos en el funcionamiento de la inteligencia artificial. Este mito no solo se observa en los discursos de algunos, por ejemplo, en la página de Dell Technologies, también dice lo siguiente: para aprovechar al máximo el valor contenido en los datos, las compañías necesitan incorporar inteligencia artificial a sus flujos de trabajo y a veces sacar al ser humano del camino. También se observa en la creación y puesta en marcha de sistemas de inteligencia artificial para gestionar casi en su totalidad los más diversos ámbitos de la vida humana: sistemas de contratación de empleados, de otorgamiento de créditos, de control policial, de evaluación docente, de elaboración de sentencias judiciales, diagnóstico médico, etc. En el libro de Catherine O'Neill es posible leer sobre estos y otros ejemplos y ver de qué modo la inteligencia artificial termina tomando decisiones fundamentales para la vida humana, y sus conclusiones son aceptadas acríticamente casi como una especie de palabra revelada. Todos los mitos se basan en verdades objetivas, y es cierto que la inteligencia artificial puede colaborar con el ser humano en mejorar aspectos de la vida. En esto no se diferencia de la función que ha tenido la técnica a lo largo de la historia, aunque en este caso es cierto que el planteo es exponencial y radical por la velocidad y por el impacto que supone su avance. En este mito, la distorsión o desvío que advierte Barthes en este tipo de figuras se produce ya desde el mismo nombre del fenómeno. El hecho de plantear una similitud o imitación de la inteligencia artificial respecto de la inteligencia humana es imposible porque en los suyos, desde su constitución, son radicalmente diversas. Desde el inicio, el mundo tecnológico ha utilizado palabras de nuestro mundo cotidiano para nombrar los nuevos objetos, ¿no? Una retórica, como afirma Sadin, que ha incorporado incluso metáforas completas para que los usuarios podamos tener un mayor acceso o un acceso más fácil a ellas, ¿no? Por ejemplo, ya la tradicional metáfora del escritorio que surgió con las computadoras personales. El desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial no es la excepción, pero no por eso debemos ponerla en pie de igualdad con la inteligencia humana, y menos hacerlas competir dando por ganado el partido a la inteligencia artificial por su supuesta superioridad. En este sentido se produce lo que Barthes llama la privación de la historia del objeto del cual se habla, no solo por el uso acrítico del nombre, sino porque no se realizan las preguntas necesarias que deberían anteceder a la consideración de la inteligencia artificial. ¿Cuándo nace? ¿Con qué objetivo? ¿Cómo funciona? ¿Quiénes la desarrollan actualmente? ¿Con qué intenciones? ¿Cuáles son sus usos? Etcétera. En la visión optimista de las habilidades de la inteligencia artificial se olvida también la cada vez más grande brecha digital que se produce en el mundo, dado que, contrariamente a lo que afirman los idearios de los tecnooptimistas, los avances, progresos y mejoras que prometen no se darán de una forma generalizada en todo el mundo, ni serán accesibles a todas las personas, ni serán tampoco provechosos para todos, ¿no? En el sentido no solo de que muchos quedarán aparte, sino que muchos sistemas, si no se vigilan atentamente, pueden provocar daños a las personas. Por otro lado, unido a este mito, avanza con la figura retórica de la verificación, pues se presenta como evidente que el conocimiento producido por las ciencias duras o exactas, y por tanto el surgido de los datos, es superior, más objetivo, más puro, podríamos decir, o más verdadero que el de otros conocimientos en los que la subjetividad humana generaría, por ejemplo, para esta visión, errores o parcialidades, los llamados sesgos. Este discurso emana principalmente de sectores políticos y empresariales que se ven beneficiados económica y o simbólicamente por la generalización de este mito. Las empresas desarrollan la inteligencia artificial y la comercialización de objetos existentes y nuevos es casi infinita. Y los gobiernos buscan beneficiarse creyendo que la inteligencia artificial será la solución para todos los problemas de gestión que enfrentan, y además que los hace ver como innovadores, ¿no? Y esto tendría un efecto positivo en los votantes. Se relaciona también este mito con la filosofía que emana de Silicon Valley, como indica Sadin en su libro La silicolonización del mundo, y que podríamos llamar una especie de hiperbolización redentora. Por ejemplo, en 1984 Steve Jobs ya afirmaba, la Mac salvará al mundo, ¿no? Y hoy en día Google es un poco más prudente en su afirmación, pero en la página en la que habla sobre sus desarrollos de inteligencia artificial, afirma que esta crea nuevas oportunidades y mejora la vida de las personas. Según este mito, la tecnología salva al hombre, lo hace mejor intrínsecamente, no solo en la resolución de problemas o tareas, y esto es así porque para esta ideología el hombre es imperfecto, está roto, se equivoca y por tanto debe ser arreglado, ¿no? Esto dice Saden en su libro, El núcleo de la imperfección fundamental del mundo, el vector mayor que asfixia su dinámica en fusión, que se aferra a neutralizarlo, es lo humano mismo. En su finitud cognitiva, sus creencias, sus vacilaciones, sus dudas, sus errores de juicio, constituye el factor de inercia mayor, representa al enemigo. Pero ha tenido lugar un milagro, la humanidad ha dirigido un instrumento capaz de redimirla y guiarla lo mejor posible. La potencia
Clara, sorry to
sobrenatural.
cut you off. If you have any final words to wrap up your presentation.
Sí, ahora ya estaba terminando. Bueno, finalmente hay que decir que la postura de Saden también es muy extrema, ¿no? En este caso, lo que hay que hacer es en realidad matizar y saber que la inteligencia artificial es útil, pero es deficiente para ser considerada como el único parámetro para definir una verdad y tomar decisiones. Habría que dejar de lado las posturas que favorecen la contraposición para hablar en favor de la integración y el acoplamiento, en términos de Simondon, del hombre y de la máquina, para que sean mejores juntos de lo que serían separados. Simondon dice acoplamiento interindividual entre el hombre y la máquina, por el cual las mismas funciones se cumplen mejor en esa colaboración que entre las dos partes separadas. Aquí se puede optar por dos opciones: o consideramos todas las inteligencias al mismo nivel, humana, animal, vegetal y artificial, y por tanto el acoplamiento debe darse en función del bienestar de todas ellas, o se considera en cierto nivel de superioridad la inteligencia humana por la dignidad, y se orientan las acciones a la consecución del desarrollo humano, supeditando el desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial al bien de la humanidad y del medio ambiente, que sería el resto de los seres vivientes. El otro mito que pensaba tratar, pero que no llegó, sería negativo, ¿no? Que la inteligencia artificial destruirá millones de puestos de trabajo. Y mi propuesta es que, bueno, esto que les decía al principio, que desde la semiótica es interesante, me parece, desarrollar herramientas para generar pensamiento crítico en torno a la tecnología en una nueva vía de lo que las humanidades pueden aportar a nuestro mundo. Muchas gracias.
And then the next presenter we have is Rumiana Stefanova from Bulgaria. Her presentation title is Visual Graphic Language in Application Programs. She is a doctor and principal lecturer in multimedia and computer graphic design at New Bulgarian University and has a master's degree in engineering. Her specialization is in applied mathematics and computer science, and her PhD is in the field of semiotics. Her thesis is related to semiotics in the field of computer graphics, advertising, and communication. She has published articles and reports from national and international conferences in the field of semiotics, computer science, and project management. And her focus is on languages, media, and communication. The floor is now yours.
Hello from Sofia. My presentation, you see, is focused on the visual graphic language associated with a variety of shapes and symbolic signs according to their connotative content, changing when working with the main indicator in graphics programs, the cursor or the pointer. It is not static, but a living element and changes its graphics appearance very dynamically according to the specific functionality it controls and manages. The graphics language of the cursor creates a code for communication in which the semiosis manifests itself as an iconic index with a developing denotative, connotative nature. And here my presentation, please, just a minute. Move this. Just a minute. Visual graphic language in application programs. The context language in graphic application programs. The idea for this study arose during my lectures with graphic design students and working with them to use application programs for the image processing and structuring, as well as press programs, in particular in design. There is in Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator. The presentation is focusing on the visual graphic language related to the variety of forms and symbolic signs according to their connotative content, which change when working with the main status indicator in the graphic programs, the cursor or the pointer. It is not a static, but a living tool and changes its graphical appearance very dynamically, depending on the specific functionality it controls and manages. The size system of the graphical user interface in the form of static icons is not the subject of this study. The cursor in the graphical interface appears in two main forms. The first as a text indicator in command line interfaces or text editors. I'm not looking at that. Secondly, as a cursor on a pointing device, most often the mouse. This is the field of consideration.
One second, Rumiana, do you have a presentation that you're trying to show?
What?
We don't see anything we don't see your video or a screen sharing.
Please. Just a minute.
Many thanks.
Oh,
Okay, perfect. Now we can
sorry.
see.
Oh, sorry. Very sorry. So sorry. Because okay. For example, pen tool for vector paths. It's a pen tool with plus it anchor point, subtract anchor point with minus, and convert anchor point, and others. The pen, for example, the pen tool with additional signs according to its actions. Ready to draw a path with X. Position pointer over a path to add a point with plus. A position pointer over a path to remove a point with these signs. When the out or options key is held down, these signs are added to the cursor, indicating what action to performs. Please. This is my presentation. For example, additional elements to the cursor when working with text. Horizontal text on, horizontal text in path, place text into when this and this side, text touch up to vertical text, and many other signs you see. Other cursor indicators, there's with hand, and very interesting working with perspective in Illustrator and clues in which plane we are. This is blue and green and orange when we working in this platform. Gradient and science cursor with other supplements here in this slide. Other interactive characters, very interesting. Overflow text here and text frames with signs. Every square subject has a specific contextual meaning here, here, and here. Marking, of course, of the objects here of the frames colors, graphic frames on the frame and on the image in brown and on the frame in blue. It's very interesting for students and other communication. The change and transformation of the figures is according to the place of the starting point which we set. This is for a reference point. And where is a reference point? Horizontal and vertical raises cursor it other. Transformation tools, constrain, free transform, perspective distort, free distort. It's very interesting for others. Each sign has a structural social meaning and can be used as a sign only if it is adopted by the members of the respective community. Each sign fully performs its functions only if its two manifestations are equivalent. The first, sensory perception in a specific sign situation and ideal in the mind of the user. In the first case, the sign is manifested with specific physical dimensions and time-space coordinates. And in the second, it is manifested as a unity of content, plane, and plane of expression. The behavior of the cursor is related to different connotative content and just creates a visual and dynamic graphic language, giving rise to a specific sign system. That is why I base my reasoning on the basic semiotic theories of sign systems. Semiosis exists in the present of a set of signs and rules that together form the code through which communication takes place. Semiosis is a dynamic process formed by the interpretation of a sign in a specific sign system, which is necessary for the sign to exist as such. This process may involve verbal or non-verbal signs. Signs are grouped into sign system where the dimensions of semiosis defined by the American semiotic Charles Morris are represented by three dimensions studied in different disciplines. Syntax, semantics, pragmatics, syntax, of course, arrangement and sequence of elements in complete systems. Semantics, the relation of the sign to what it represents or replaces as object of study. And pragmatics, the relationship between the signs in a system and their user, creators, and interpreters. Sign systems are divided into three main types: language system, of course, primary, secondary, with artificial character with rank in natural language, and secondary with the artificial character without rank in natural language, program, information, etc. Sign systems related to the language converts primary, each alphabet, and secondary, Morse, Braille, each code, etc. Auxiliary, the paralanguage, the strange and number of the voice, read, intonation, and accent, and for the written language, handwriting, and non-linguistic, iconic, indexical, and symbolic.
You have 5 minutes
My
left.
conclusions. Based on the above, I formulate the existence of semiosis in the graphical sign system of making and indicating the cursor and other elements for marking the interface. It is a non-linguistic system according to its origin. The sign system is iconic index according to the relation to the denoted object. the denotative-connotative nature of the graphic sign system is multi-layered and evolving. Its pragmatic aspects are manifested by various functionality and navigation options. Iconic signs are visual text that can no longer be analyzed in sign or figures, which interface of iconic text establish codes. In this way, symbolic functions are produced. Humberto Eco. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So we can go ahead and start a discussion. So if anyone wants to like write any messages in the chat room or just start speaking on the mic, we can do that.
Okay, if you have any question, please send them by
I see
email. I want to attend.
Sylvia has her hand raised.
Hola, tengo una pregunta para María Clara. María Clara, ¿podrías esbozarnos brevemente de pronto ese segundo mito que no nos alcanzaste a abordar?
Sí, es un mito que estaba justo conversando por chat con Silvia Villarreal, porque yo lo tomé desde el lado de los tecnopesimistas, ¿no? Que hablan de que la inteligencia artificial va a dejar a millones de personas sin trabajo en breve. No es que sea mentira, ¿no? Sino es que hay una serie de estudios, ¿no? Primero que postulan que esto es real, y otra serie de estudios que postulan que esto no va a ser tan definitivo ni tan rápido como lo piensan los tecnopesimistas, ¿no? Y esto es por un lado, bueno, el discurso tecnopesimista apocalíptico que se ha dado muchas veces a lo largo de la historia, que es esa cuestión de viene el fin del mundo, la inteligencia artificial nos va a dominar, ¿no? Y genera recelo y miedo respecto de la inteligencia artificial, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ese sería un problema, pero al mismo tiempo los tecno-optimistas han tomado este mito y lo han transformado en algo para exaltar la inteligencia artificial, ¿no? O sea, qué bueno que en unos años la inteligencia artificial va a avanzar tanto que va a poder reemplazarnos en muchas tareas, no solo en aquellas automáticas o rutinarias, sino también en aquellas que requieren un comportamiento adaptativo por parte de la gente inteligente, ¿no? Y entonces los hombres van a poder vivir su vida sin trabajar y recibiendo una renta básica universal, ¿no? Y esta es una postura que no contempla cuál es el lugar y el rol y la importancia del trabajo en la vida, ¿no? De las personas en general y en su dignidad. Entonces, bueno, es un mito, hay varias cuestiones para decir, pero es un mito que funciona como en estas dos direcciones ideológicas, ¿no? A favor y en contra de la tecnología.
Bianca, no te estamos escuchando. Muchísimas gracias, Clara, por la respuesta.
I would like to ask the same question for Alec because they have the maybe same approach. As proposed by Maria Clara, Alec, do you think that this artificial intelligence would control our home and our daily lives? What do you think, Alec?
I don't think so to an extent, because it's one of these things that we have to give them the control. So it's not so much that, like, you know, once we appropriate this technology, they tell us how we live. Because like for me, I like the idea of like smart fridges, being able to tell me like what's in my fridge and being able to give me new recipes that are based off of the ingredients that I have in my kitchen. So in a way, it could tell me how to live, but it's not like I truly have to like listen to this fridge to tell me what to cook. So in a way, it is more so of a tool to essentially enhance the quality of life, because that's essentially how I want to relate semiotics to this sort of like revolutionary technology, rather than focusing more so on like this commodification of brands and everything, to look at how this technology is like shaping our living habitat. So when it comes to like AI in homes, South Korea is doing a lot when it comes to creating these software-defined smart homes. But in the US, it hasn't really gotten to that point by any means. So within the next 20 years, I would say we will start seeing like homes with this sort of technology. But right now, yeah, it's still like in the, you know, there's a lot of discussion in AI on like the type of like AI, because like for me, the notion of the Umwelt, so this like subjective reality, that was what got me into this conversation, this topic, like, does a smart home have an Umwelt? So in my opinion, once this smart home can have the neural networks and it can understand these different environmental stimuli, that's when it can lead to this like proto Umwelt. But right now, given this technology, it's still very limited. So in the future, it will change though. No, your mic is off.
Yeah, many things. For Alec as well, and maybe for Maria Clara. What are the most common like difficulties or not the proper to, you know, like if you don't have the phonetics, for example, you cannot connect your home. So if you don't properly know how to do the question, the home won't react as you want. What other considerations besides phonetics? What else we should consider to control our homes?
I don't know, because it's, if you don't if you don't know how to appropriate it, you're just gonna get frustrated and you're gonna want to break this $1,000 device for acting not smart. So yeah, it's one of these like I don't know. This is something where I'm trying to get into like enhancing what's being offered rather than because the way I like to put it is like smart devices, they're only smart only if you don't appropriate them in dumb ways. So like if you do things to like invoke laziness or not sort of this action, you're not really capitalizing on what the performance value is. So this is something where affordances definitely come into play. But from the AI perspective, I mean, Clara, if you have anything to add to that.
Sí, yo trabajaba un poco el tema he trabajado un poco el tema de las interfaces y las affordances. Me parece un tema muy importante en nuestra relación con los dispositivos tecnológicos, pero he estado leyendo bastante porque IBM, Google y algunas empresas tecnológicas de las más importantes están desarrollando lo que sería la neurotecnología, ¿no? Y en ese caso ya ni siquiera vamos a necesitar decir las cosas porque el objetivo de este desarrollo es que los dispositivos puedan leer nuestro cerebro, ¿no? Entonces ya ahí no sería, por ejemplo, la fonética ya no sería un problema para comunicarnos, ¿no? Sino que serían una serie de sensores que tomarían datos incluso sin que nosotros nos demos cuenta o demos el consentimiento en cada ocasión, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, esto por supuesto tiene una serie de dilemas semióticos y éticos para considerar, ¿no? Pero un poco también se va avanzando en ese sentido. Y perdón, una cosita que quería decir del segundo mito, que me quedó en el tintero, pero que es importante porque no quiero sonar tecnopesimista, es que el problema de ese mito de decir que la inteligencia artificial va a dejar a millones sin trabajo es que se coarta la creatividad y la capacidad de adaptación y de flexibilidad que tiene el ser humano ante el desarrollo de cualquier objeto o tecnología que cambie sus modos de vida, ¿no? Entonces, lo que hay que apuntar es que si la inteligencia artificial va a tomar muchos trabajos, hay que formarnos y formar a las próximas generaciones en los nuevos trabajos que surjan y en las nuevas acciones y lugares y roles que debemos tomar como seres humanos frente al avance de las máquinas. Gracias.
Christian, do you have a question? Your mic is off also.
Yes, thank you, Alec. I want to comment on your presentation and on the idea of the smart devices controlling our life. By the way, this was I presented something in Tartu in this sense. How, from the point of view of companies, looks this, because as soon as we adopt smart devices in our homes, companies will start to collect data. They will start to trace our habits in order to perform better, to indicate us in a better way how to proceed. One aspect of this is that artificial intelligence is to collect statistical data and to impose this data into the predictive, let's say, algorithms of these devices. But the other side, and they goes hand in hand, is that the commercial logic will be introduced in this way. So, okay, we are savvy users, we don't get too much, let's say, influence. However, the way the companies run this opportunity to help our lives is with algorithms whose final logic is commercial, profit oriented. So there might be a subtle level in which the smart devices use, however, induce habits in our everyday routines, which in the end of the day serve profit, let's say, goals of companies.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's definitely one of the aspects that attracted me to this sort of like topic in the semiotic stance, because it definitely has this aspect of like risk versus reward. Like, what are you giving up in order to increase your leisure ability or your just your connectivity to all your devices? Because it's the corporations that are very keeping the technology very limited, and it's keeping the growth very just minuscule. So when it comes to these very typical like smart home devices, that's definitely in the realm of consumerism. And rather than getting like fixated on like a specific type of like use case, which is why I'm trying to get into more so like the senior citizens, and more so specifically senior citizens in Estonia, because the culture of Estonia being like this e-digital environment, it already has a strong connection with this sort of this digital sort of surveillance and this digital information. And on top of it, when you have a culture that is very introverted to begin with, how do they perceive this sort of technology? Do they perceive it as this sort of invasiveness into their own home? Because like so that's something where I'm trying to look more at, rather than in like the typical like US consumerism notion, because there is relevant research to it, but it definitely comes down to the sort of risk and reward, I would say. Because like for me, like, well, looking at like use cases for like senior citizens, if they can have the knowing that like if they live by themselves and they accidentally fall, and this device is made to help them like call the emergency services, then maybe this sort of not intrusive data, but this sort of being able to collect and compile the data from the sensors and everything. So that's more so what I'm trying to look at, because the data privacy itself is a big issue. Because one thing I read is how the technologies, like smart home technologies for senior citizens, are by like the offspring, so like the children, and yet these devices are made for, the elders, but yet, so there's this sort of like ethical and legality aspect on like, in in-home health or assisted living, if they don't want to be like surveilled, where is this legal stance on whether they can opt out or not? And whose actual final say is it? Is it the one who's paying the healthcare, or is it the one who's living within the assisted living? Yeah, the data privacy, that's something that you can spend years researching. But looking at this meaning making component, and these semiotic components, that's something that you can identify what sort of scaffolding you're able to, construct within a home itself. And then we have a couple more minutes for questions if anybody has anything else.
So I was expecting or just asking to you, when you consider these ethical issues, maybe it would be like interesting to maybe have you consider something about this gender situation, because sometimes when this artificial intelligence connect with your home or with the results that you're looking for, also for Maria Clara, they only speak about male responses. When we are talking in Spanish or maybe in Russian and maybe in French, we have this feminine like different other ways of thinking. So have you ever considered these other responses from the artificial intelligence and maybe from your home affordances or smart affordances? Have you ever
well, for me, what I'm trying to eventually, like how I'm trying to orient my research right now is I've discussed how smart homes are interactive systems. So these affordance systems, we rely on these affordance systems in order to interact, whether it's with the designer or with the smart home system. But eventually, what I'm going to be getting at, when like this notion of AI, is to look more so into intelligent systems. So rather than getting caught up in the like the aspect of AI, I'm more so trying to integrate this intelligent system to see how these computer programming affordances are correlated to like the stimuli within the smart home, because like the AI, it will just be changing so quick, in my opinion, so it won't really be a constant. But if I can look at the actual, like the theoretical modeling on like what actually is intelligent systems for a smart home, that would be much worthwhile for this time.
Maybe I could can answer this. María Clara, ¿tú has considerado estos aspectos sobre las respuestas de las inteligencias artificiales sobre lo femenino y los masculinos, lo que serían las declinaciones?
No específicamente sobre el tema de género, es algo que tengo en mente como para avanzar en algún momento, pero sí es cierto que los sistemas son, y las interfaces que tienen estos sistemas, son diseñadas y son programados por humanos, ¿no? Y ya se ha comprobado en reiteradas ocasiones que estos humanos, que además el grupo mayoritario es de hombres blancos, ingenieros, ¿no? En general. Hay muy pocas mujeres trabajando en inteligencia artificial, y está todo muy concentrado en Estados Unidos, específicamente en San Francisco, bueno, y en otros lugares que imitan, ¿no? Como Silicon Valley. Pero ya se ha comprobado, ¿no? Y de hecho estas empresas tratan de responder, que hay muchos sesgos en la inteligencia artificial. Incluso en el reconocimiento de imágenes de Google, por ejemplo, contaban el caso de que un taladro, como estaba en manos de una mujer, ¿no?
with Maria Clara.
Well,
I think we lost her.
yeah, I think so too.
I think we lost her. Maybe just for the end of this meeting. Alec, I would like to ask you maybe something about how these, as your approach, how these responses or the significant responses are very connected with commercial issues. As for example, Alexa is always asking us, would you like to buy these or would you like to add a credit for this? So the only affordances for these smart homes are just commercial. Would you please give us some more details?
So when it comes to like the different type of smart home systems, there's two main types. Like one that relies on like cloud-based servers, which is the typical type of smart home. So like this is the one that's found like on a grid. So they're the ones that are connected to, you know, Google and Amazon and whatnot. But the other type is smart homes with internal servers. And in my opinion, these are the much more safer ways to like have control over your own life and your own habitat. But again, it comes with a cost in a way. Because the internal service smart homes, they're much more expensive to install, and you can't have like remote features to it. So you can't use your smartphone in order to open up your garage and just do stuff like that. But you do have more security in that sense. So it really just depends on what sort of like ground level affordances you're looking at, whether it's the affordances of leisurability, remote connectivity, or security. So if you're kind of scaffolding your home to be more secure or more reliant to like get some like, you know, solar energy and stuff like that, internal server smart homes are much more practical, but they're much more expensive because they're made custom for your home rather than just kind of this appropriation of technology like what we usually see in consumerism.
Yeah, many thanks, Sally.
Me había quedado sin internet, perdón.
Would you like to continue with your explanation about quisieras continuar con tu explicación acerca de sus sesgos, María Clara?
Sí, no sé si dónde quedé, pero lo que decía era que, bueno, que los modelos sobre los que están programados los algoritmos y los sistemas de inteligencia artificial están hechos por personas, ¿no? Por eso, y esas personas tienen sesgos y eso se traslada, o sea, no hay una, la neutralidad de la tecnología es otro mito, ¿no? Porque está manejada y programada y pensada por hombres y por humanos, digo, y lo que decía Cristian, ¿no? Cristian tiene razón. Hasta ahora el principal objetivo es comercial, ¿no? Y utilitario. Hasta ahora no hay otros ámbitos que se hayan apropiado de la tecnología abiertamente y el objetivo de esta gente es hacer dinero. Entonces, bueno, hay sesgos de género, ya hay bastante analizado sobre eso, no solo de género, sino racial también. Religioso, bueno, hay distintos, pero lo importante es saber que no hay neutralidad en la tecnología y hay que estar un poco atentos a eso, ¿no? Y quizás en vez de que haya un solo programador detrás de los sistemas, que haya equipos, ¿no? Donde cada uno pueda aportar y evaluar el sistema para ver cuáles van a ser las consecuencias de su uso y las dinámicas que se produzcan, ¿no?
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, María Clara.
De nada.
Bueno, pues estamos entonces muy bien de tiempo el día de hoy. Nos avanzamos un poquito. Entonces, Silvia, cuéntanos. Muchas gracias a los tres. Many thanks to the three of you.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Que tengan buen día.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias a ustedes por estas ponencias y por estos diálogos que emergen. Seguramente, como en otras presentaciones, nos quedan muchas más inquietudes por resolver. Y bueno, esperamos que este sea un escenario para conectar estos diferentes intereses que surgen acá. Vamos a continuar con nuestra programación. Les comento, a las 10:15 empezamos con la siguiente mesa, titulada Semiótica, Cognición y Creación. Sin embargo, tenemos un tiempo prudente en el cual podemos hacer la presentación de uno de los resultados creativos de este congreso, para lo cual le cedo la palabra a Bianca.
Bien. Estoy intentando abrir el libro, pero entonces voy a tener que darme unos segunditos para abrirlo desde aquí, que no lo he podido encontrar aquí en la presentación. Voy a tener que cambiar de plataforma. Denme un segundo, por favor.